Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are zooming in from around the world. Today, we are very excited to have Anthony Shillito joining us from the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. And he's going to talk about Life Finds a Way, Understanding the Theater of Terrestrialization, which is a very exciting title. So really excited about the talk. Before we get started, just a little bit of introduction for today's seminar. If this is the first time that you're attending one of the Paleo Perk seminars, so we're currently going over the welcome and announcements, following which we will have Anthony's talk, which will be about 30 minutes. Following that, we will have a moderated question and answers. And after that, Anthony will be sticking around for the after talk tea with the speakers. And so students and postdocs are highly encouraged to stay around and ask Anthony about his academic journey or the research projects that he's currently doing and his future plans. And don't forget to send your questions via chat to the Questions Paleo Perks host, who today is Rehmat. So a little bit about the housekeepings. If you haven't already gone through our code of conduct, we please ask that you go to our website and abide and agree to our code of conduct for today's seminar. You should be muted so Anthony can give a concentrated seminar, but if you find yourself unmuted for some reason, please mute yourself during the duration of the talk. Again, you can ask questions, or if there are any technical issues, they should all go to questions@PaleoPerks host. And if you want to ask a question at the end of the seminar, you can also use the raise hand function and we will unmute you and you will be able to ask Anthony your question. We also have closed captions now available via Zoom. You can use the CC button to show or hide them. And if you know any outstanding early career researcher, please feel free to nominate them. That link should be available in the Zoom chat. There's also a weekly feedback link that will be dropped momentarily, and that is to it's anonymous, optional, but highly encouraged, so we know how we can better serve the Paleo Perks community or the Paleo community in general. So a little bit about today's speaker. Anthony did his bachelor's and master's in natural sciences from the University of Cambridge, following which he did his PhD in geology, also from the University of Cambridge. After his PhD, he was a junior research fellow at University of Oxford, and currently Anthony is a Banting postdoctoral researcher at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. And with that, Anthony, if you would like to take over the screen share.
Absolutely. Great. I think that's what I want to share. Thank you very much to the Paleo Perks Committee for the introduction. As I said, I'm Anthony Shillito, and I'm currently a Banting postdoctoral researcher at University of Saskatchewan in Canada. Started there in late last year, and I'll be here for 2 years. So my talk today is about the initial colonization of land by animals. I'm going to talk about the first time transitions between marine and terrestrial lifestyles occurred. And I'm going to focus on invertebrates, but I want to add a bit of context in from plants and animals and other animals, and the feedbacks between organisms and environment. So to set the scene, and because I like paleo art, this picture takes us back over 400 million years when the world was a very different place and when animals were first taking those important steps. So the focus of this talk is pretty broad, and I'm aiming to cover the initial transition onto land of plants, invertebrates, and vertebrates. Think about how they diversified once they got onto land, and a bit about how they interacted with the environments that they were colonizing. So the focal point of my work for the past 7.5 years has been the terrestrialization of invertebrates. So that's where a lot of the meat of this talk is, but the process can't be looked at without considering what was going on in the other groups alongside them. The key interval we're looking at from this is from the Cambrian to the end of the Devonian. And whilst this is when most of the action is happening, particularly for the invertebrates, we might spill over a bit into the Carboniferous and maybe even a bit of the Permian a few times during this talk. So the action starts towards the end of the Cambrian. Then we get some more excursions in the middle Ordovician before really things start to kick off as we enter the end of the Silurian and get into the Devonian. And for a final bit of context, this is a paleogeographic reconstruction of what the world will have looked like around the time when things were beginning in the Ordovician. You can see that we have two major continents here, Gondwana to the south and east, and Laurentia to the west, as well as a host of minor continents in between, such as Baltica, which is kind of the modern day Baltic, in the south, and Amoria further north. A lot of the land was in the tropics at this time, and that remains the case into the Silurian. So within the last few years, we've had plenty of advances in our knowledge of the earliest land plants, or land plant ancestors, with the discovery of cryptospores from the late Cambrian to the earliest Ordovician. This is the first point we can place our timeline of plant terrestrialization. And it suggests that land plants evolved from charophyte algae ancestors in the early to middle Ordovician. The oldest known evidence for land plants themselves comes a little bit later, but also in the form of spores, this time from the middle Ordovician Zanjung Formation from Argentina. Now, spores are where a lot of our information about the early emergence of land plants comes from. They're extremely fossilizable compared to skeletal fragments of the plants themselves, because they're very hard and plants produce and disperse large quantities of them. So they're often found out of situ in marine deposits, which more readily preserve fossils than terrestrial settings. You can see the spores here dated at 472 million years before present. And it's important to note that these are only the oldest known plant spores. We can't say for sure that they're the oldest that have ever existed. It's possible that they're the oldest preserved, but 15 years ago, we thought that 463 million-year-old spores from Oman were the oldest. So it's not unreasonable to expect that date to move back again at some point in the future. Molecular clock estimates are still a bit out of step with the fossil evidence, but over the past 10 years, the clock models have moved and become much closer to fossil ages. It's reasonable to believe the body fossil record is generally poor due to a multitude of issues with preservation, and so the true origin's likely earlier than body fossils suggest. However, it's harder to reconcile some of the molecular estimates with sedimentological evidence, which shows that in the Ordovician plants really started to influence sedimentary landscapes, and not before that. Based on microfossil evidence, land plants appear to have maintained a low diversity characterized by simple diminutive forms for 30 to 40 million years after their emergence. After this, the vascular plants, or tracheophytes, took off, radiating in the Silurian and early Devonian. After this, land plants developed rapidly, with the evolution of vascular plant roots with meristems appearing in the Lochkovian, wood by the Pragian to Emsium, and trees by the Ophelian. Going left to right, we have examples of woody debris from the Devonian of Svalbard, with strands of xylem, more complex woody fragments, and finally, a 2-meter-long log of Archaeopteris in the top right. Into the Carboniferous, trees underwent 3 major paleobotanical shifts. First, increasing in wetland species diversity around the Mississippian, Pennsylvanian boundary, and the origination and diversification of the earliest Corditelians and conifers. We can see some indication of this here, where black marks the location of paleotropical coal forests through the early Pennsylvanian. However, this was followed in the Casamovian, so around 305 million years ago, by the collapse of rainforest biotas, which led to a reduction in the area of tropical forests, extinction of diverse lycopsids, and a shift in the predominant peat mire vegetation from lycopsids to tree ferns. Finally, when we get into the Permian, as you can see in the last 2 images in the bottom right, woody seed-bearing plants with increased drought tolerance began to rise to prominence. And just as a bit of an overview of the rise of land plants, I think this figure gives an idea of the changes vegetation underwent from the Lower Devonian into the Carboniferous. As you can see, the depth and complexity of rooting systems increased massively, with early Carboniferous examples appearing in some ways very similar to modern root systems. So now on to something which I am a little more expert in, the record of terrestrialization of invertebrates. And this record is best known through trace fossils, or footprints and burrows of animals preserved in the raw record. There's a good body fossil record as well, and of course I'll touch on the unique information that body fossils can provide. But the majority of our knowledge of when invertebrates were actually first moving into different environments comes from traces like these. These are just a few examples of the different sorts of things that I've seen on field work during my PhD and my subsequent research. So with this high production value cartoon I produced, this gives an idea of the preservational advantages that trace fossils may have over body fossils. That's because trace fossils are only really destroyed by physical reworking of the sediment that they're created in, rather than biological consumption by other animals or chemical decay, as can occur with body fossils. Yeah, hopefully, even though the cartoon's a little bit crummy, it gives a fairly good idea of what was going on, of why this happens. Of course, there are inherent problems with the trace fossil record as well. It's often very difficult to attribute a trace maker, for example, as many animals can produce the same traces and one animal can produce many different traces. But if we're not too tied up on specifically what animals were making them, then trace fossils can provide a lot of important information. So the earliest evidence of subaerial activity by animals comes from the Cambrian Potsdam group of Ontario and Canada. In the photo on the left, you can see arthropod trackways on a sandstone bedding surface. And the photo on the right shows the sedimentary context. In the image, you can see stripes in the sandstone go from bottom left to upper right of the image. And these are crossbeds, and from the scale of them, they're produced as aeolian crossbeds. So this means these trackways must have been made on land, which for something going on in the Cambrian is a bit of a shock. However, looking at the surrounding rocks, we can gain some broader environmental context. And seeing these rippled sandstone bedding surfaces very close by were likely deposited in shallow marine environments. And that's confirmed by nearby sections where we see, again, extensive evidence for shallow marine deposition. So we know that whilst the trackways, these first trackways on land were subaerial, they were very close to the coast. So it's more likely brief excursions made by marine animals rather than anything permanently inhabiting the continents. And that's supported by the lack of burrows as well. After the Potsdam trackways, there's a bit of a time gap with no evidence for animal life on land. People have tried to fill this with various bits of evidence, but all of them have been refuted due to lack of concrete proof that the strata were non-marine. Among the most famous of these is the Bordeaux volcanic group, where tracks and trails were described from lacustrine sandstones. And you can see some tracks going across ripple crests in the top right, and you can see some looping trails on the image in the bottom left. But a recent reanalysis of the site by myself and my PhD supervisor from 2019 suggests that instead these trails were made in the marine realm and consisted and occurred in tuff. So the animals weren't in the sea, and they were very unhappy as they're being suffocated due to all of the nearby volcanic activity. So rather than life on land or life in a lake, it's more kind of death on the shoreline. When we reach the Silurian, everything really kicks off. Across the world, invertebrate trace fossils appear in a wide range of terrestrial settings. And emergent coastal settings host diverse trace fossils with trackways and burrows in beach-type environments. The example shown here is from the Tumblr sandstone in Western Australia. It's my personal favorite formation, just because the trace fossils are extremely diverse and well exposed, and it's just a fantastic place to do field work. You can see the couple of tracks and a large burrow on the big slab that's in the middle of the image. In alluvial settings, so anything related to non-marine flowing water, these were inhabited for the first time during this interval as well by a range of different invertebrate taxa. Diversity of traces seen in alluvial settings is lower than those in emergent coastal environments, and likely because invertebrates have made this transition directly from sea to land, as shown, as evidenced by the early Paleozoic excursions that I spoke about before. That's rather than transitioning into freshwater first and then land from there. So that's probably why we're seeing less diversity in the alluvial than the coastal. And just to give a bit of more of a kind of explicit idea of the differences between early alluvial ichthyofaunas, or kind of trace fossil faunas, and those from kind of the coastal tidal flat type environments. This shows all of the reported trace fossils from all known coastal and alluvial trace-bearing formations from the Silurian to Middle Devonian. And as we can see, there's a far greater diversity of behaviors occurring in coastal rather than alluvial environments throughout this first wave of the terrestrialization process. Now, this is fully expected, as animals are still just beginning to occupy new niches in fully non-marine environments. We'll touch more on this a little bit later when we're thinking about the broad ichnological signatures of invertebrate terrestrialization. Now, the colonization of desert environments was approximately contemporaneous with that of alluvial settings, although the actual date is quite poorly constrained due to the absence of direct age indicators with the formation that contain these early traces. And sadly, that's the case with lots of the Australian strata I worked on. So what we're seeing here is trace fossils from within a damp Aeolian interdune facies from the Mereenie sandstone in central Australia. So it's an environment that may be somewhat similar to the modern white sands in New Mexico. So rather than a dry, full-on desert, it's kind of damp interdunes with large Aeolian dunes around them. So from looking at the evolution of the basin in which the Mereenie was deposited, it appears the route to land from the first desert fauna may have been a bit different to that for other early terrestrial ecosystems. During the Ordovician, the area was occupied by a transcontinental seaway known as the Larapentine Sea, which gradually closed, first forming a brackish inland sea before it was fully exhumed and the Mereenie Desert formed. And it's possible, this is my current working theory, I'd like to go back and do some more work out there. The fauna inhabiting the damp interdunes was a remnant arthropod fauna from this inland sea, facing increasing pressures to explore and inhabit subaerial settings. Now, I promised body fossils, and sadly, this is all I'm going to give you. It's around this time in the early Devonian that we also get the earliest terrestrial invertebrate body fossils, with arthropod fragments from the Ludford Lane bone bed in Shropshire and the Port Dube fish bed in Kerrera. However, the first body fossil of an animal with definitive evidence for air breathing comes slightly later, with Pneumodesmus pneumoni, as we can see here, from the Cowie Formation, which is remarkable based on because of the spiracles that can be observed, and that kind of highlighted in the image at the bottom. So the last stage of invertebrate terrestrialization occurred in lakes. Shallow and ephemeral lakes were colonized at a similar time to alluvial settings. We have evidence of that from Scotland, for example. But deep lacustrine settings, so deep enough that we're getting turbidite density flows, were colonized later. And the first evidence for that comes in the Carboniferous. These trace fossils, you see, are from the Pennsylvanian Bude Formation, and they show some of the earliest examples of invertebrate behavior recorded in these settings. So we've got trackway going across the one in the image in the top right, possibly made by a limit lid. And in the bottom left, we actually have some vertebrate traces. So these kind of fish trails. Now, this figure shows how the trace fossil record of alluvial settings changed when they were first colonized until the end of the Paleozoic. So looking first at the graph on the left, it shows how animals occupied different niches and diversified within these niches. So this is showing the ichthyodiversity and the ichthyodisparity. The three closely grouped lines essentially show niche occupation through looking at different general architectures of the traces. So that's what ichthyodisparity is. And the blue line shows the overall diversity of traces, so the number of different ichthyospecies. As you can see, during the first stages of colonization, the diversity and niche occupation increased in step. You can see that the lines are fairly closely grouped from the end of the Ordovician to the end of the Silurian. But after that, niche occupation remained relatively steady, but we still get this rapid increase in diversity, which suggests that during initial colonization, animals initially occupied all of the available niches, and then they diversified within those niches once they were secure. The graph on the right shows tiering of trace fossils and the diversity within niches at different depths within or on top of the substrate. And this shows that the main area of diversification within niches seems to have occurred at the surface, whereas diversity of infaunal traces remain relatively steady. Still considering the broad stroke signatures that we're seeing, these figures show how we see different ecological signatures depending on the composition of the substrate. So here we can see in both coastal and alluvial environments, we have more traces that frequently occur in sandstones than in mudstones. And this has been built up using a similar data set for that used for the figures on the previous page, but here just restricted from the Silurian to the Middle Devonian. Another significant signal, which differs with substrate type, is the size of the burrows that are being produced. So during the terrestrialization process, you can see that the maximum and mean sizes of the largest burrows from a given formation were much larger in sandstones than they were in mudstones. And this is likely due to the different burrowing styles, which are typically employed in different media, with sand suiting physical excavation, favored by arthropods, and mud suits crack propagation, which is favored by vermiform organisms or animals using a hydrostatic skeleton to burrow. Also, with the rise of land plants keeping more mud on and near the continents, muddy niches may not be fully exploited at this time, even in the shallow marine realm. But overall, it seems that during terrestrialization, larger animals preferentially occupied sandy settings. Once both plants and invertebrates have made their way onto land, there were of course interactions between them, and the rise of herbivory in these groups. So the photo on the left comes from the Carboniferous of Canada and shows a plant fossil with grazing trails on it. You can just pick out the small little trails on there. Figure on the right shows a long-term perspective on developments in herbivory, continuing up to the present day. I'm not going to go into too much detail because there's more depth on the next slide, but it gives some idea that there were multiple phases of herbivore expansion as dominant herbivorous arthropod taxa changed, as did the dominant host plant taxa. So this figure gives some more details in how arthropod feeding behaviors related to plants changed during the second half of the Paleozoic. As new behaviors arose, this is also the area of the talk that I'm less familiar with, so you have to bear with me a bit. But from the point where animals first came onto land, detritivory was present, as was palynivory. And these were quickly followed by fungivory near the start of the Devonian. Most of the evidence of this comes from coprolites, or so consumers aren't necessarily known, but it is known what they were consuming. The first herbivorous behaviors to emerge were surface feeding, piercing and sucking, and boring, along with evidence for pathogens likely associated with surface feeding. In the Middle Devonian, the range of behaviors increased to include hole feeding, margin feeding, and galling, and anti-herbivore defenses in plants were observed for the first time. The hexapod gap, which you can see in the late Devonian and Mississippian, coincided with a lack of advances in herbivory. But in the Pennsylvanian, seed predation and oviposition emerged. And around the Carboniferous Permian boundary, we see the first evidence for skeletonization. The terrestrialization of vertebrates differs to that of invertebrates, as the first stages appear to have been a transition from marine to freshwater, rather than from marine waters to land. There are reports of jawless fish fossils occurring outside normal marine salinity from the mid-Silurian, and jawed fish fossils from the earliest Devonian. Here you can see a fairly wet field day I spent looking at the Lesmahago in Lyre in Scotland, where some of the earliest non-marine fish fossils are known. Sadly, the fossil in the picture was not found by me. As with invertebrates, the first evidence for tetrapods on land comes from trace fossils. Here we can see examples from the Middle Devonian of Valencia Island on the left, which are the earliest unequivocal evidence for tetrapods walking on land. And from the right, on the right, you see evidence from the late Devonian of Tarbert nets. There are a few other examples of Devonian tracks that have appeared in the literature, but these are of varying veracity. The shapes of the feet of the trace makers are not clearly defined in these trackways, so we can only get limited information about them. But you do get some evidence of the gait, and that means we can comfortably and confidently say that these were produced by vertebrates. Body fossil evidence for tetrapods comes about a bit later than the earliest trackways, and are of a similar age to the Tarbert nets tracks from the previous slide. Recent work by Per Alberg suggested that the reason for this is that tetrapods emerged in inland fluvial or ephemeral lacustrine settings, which preserve few, if any, body fossils. And that would suggest that tetrapods took a different route onto land than the invertebrates. Following their establishment on land, tetrapods diversified into the Carboniferous, diversity peaking in the late Mississippian and mid-Pennsylvanian. And these graphs show total species richness for all tetrapod species, then splits for non-amniotes and amniotes, which arose around the end of the Mississippian. Here we can see the dramatic effect of the Casamovian rainforest collapse that was mentioned earlier in the talk, with non-amniote tetrapods hit particularly hard. Amniotes, on the other hand, appear to have avoided any serious consequences and continued to diversify from their emergence throughout the Carboniferous. Climate change associated with the formation of Pangaea at the end of the Carboniferous and into the Permian initially caused another dip in diversity. And this is just to show the rainforest collapse on this paleogeographic map with the disappearance of coal. Tetrapods adapted to the ongoing climate change by exploiting newly available niches that were emerging, and the Carboniferous and Permian trace fossil record of vertebrates reveals that deserts were fully colonized during this window. So this figure aims to quickly try and show the varying paths onto land that different groups took. Whilst the majority of invertebrate taxa have gone directly from marine or marine-influenced environments, as I said earlier, vertebrates and plants appear to have moved more into freshwater and then colonized the land from there. So the last thing I want to talk about before wrapping up is the effect of mass extinctions on the colonization of land. So during the interval in which terrestrialization occurred, there were two mass extinctions, the Endordovician and the late Devonian, or Devonian. The Endordovician mass extinction was restricted to the oceans. However, the Hanantian glaciation, which is regarded as the cause of the mass extinction, may have been brought about by the rise of land plants. The impact of the late Devonian mass extinction on terrestrialization is pretty controversial, as the fossil records sparse in the lead up to and aftermath of the events. Some argue that it was catastrophic for the recently terrestrialized tetrapods, whereas others identify no major tetrapod extinction. This graph's intended to give some idea of the impact of the extinction on invertebrates in alluvial settings by showing how trace fossil diversity changed during the early stages of terrestrialization. From the first colonization of these habitats in the Silurian, diversity rapidly increased into the early Devonian, as you see by the peak of the graph. However, in the late Devonian, it collapsed again. Now, this may be in part due to the smaller number of trace-bearing sites in this time interval, and a similar problem which restricts our knowledge of the impact on tetrapods. However, the trace-bearing sites that we do know all have exceptionally low diversity. Casamovian rainforest collapse, not regarded as a mass extinction, was clearly catastrophic for the tetrapods, as we saw the diversity dramatically increase. But the subsequent reorganization of the flora to deal with the increasing aridity during the Permian may have encouraged faunal diversification. As you can see, this really taking off here, as tropical forest biomes were more partitioned. I've put this figure up to finish because I think it emphasizes one of the most important points about this transition, life from to land. And this figure covers far more than just the transition of life to land. It aims to show how life has affected sedimentary environments through evolutionary innovation, both with signatures which depend on biology and those which are merely influenced by it. I think life-changing sedimentary environments is an important theme of the initial colonization of land. And it's important to remember that whilst the environments being colonized placed initial constraints on the transition, the organisms that occupied the available niches rapidly rebuilt those environments in their own image, either completely, like plants, or partially, like bioturbators. It's amazing how many lithologies, materials, or structures essentially evolved at a given point in time, because the key organisms responsible for producing these evolved then. For the conclusion slide, I'm just going to put up this little summary that highlights when these key innovations occurred. So many major evolutionary innovations occurred during the Paleozoic colonization of land, with environments placing initial controls on colonization, and then the organisms engineering the environments they moved into. You see that particularly with plants affecting fluvial styles, and then interactions between arthropod plants. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and I'd like to acknowledge the various people that have worked with me on this kind of broad terrestrialization project. Lots of the work was, well, the majority of my work's been with Neil Davis, who supervised me for my PhD, and would probably be horrified that I found the youngest possible photo of him that I could online. And I'm now working with Luis Guatoir and Gabriela Mangano out here in Canada. But all of these people contributed to this broader understanding of the terrestrialization process. So with that, thank you very much all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Anthony, for the great talk. And yeah, thank you for joining us as well to the audience members. And if you have any questions, please send them to the questions at PaleoPerks host. We already have a few that have sort of trickled in as you were giving your talk. The first one was actually already dropped in the chat box, but I will drop it again. It is by Kurt Lindy, and he is asking, was the Alex Bay trace fossils of roots from the Ordovician?
I'm not sure what the Alex Bay, sadly, I'm not familiar with that, but if we are seeing Ordovician stuff, it's something that I'd like to check out. I'd be surprised if we're seeing like serious root traces in the Ordovician, because we don't tend to get much evidence of like proper roots until we're getting into the latest Silurian, early Devonian. But I'll have to, yeah, that's something that I'd be interested to have a look at. Okay,
great. And then we have another question by Kay Cinder, who, and I've dropped this again in the chat, who has asked, in the latest invasion of the lakes, will the variation in different wave bases, if different lakes caused due to the supercontinents, affect egg laying, reproduction in some of the Elpistostrillians and the Poropyforums? I'm a geochemist, so I apologize. Is the way that I am.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think the depth of the wave base absolutely affects how animals are living in a setting. If you're living above the fair weather wave base, then you're being affected by much more like consistent high energy flow, and not just in the way that in the tides. So it's not just disruptive and disruptive, but it's also providing increased nutrients. But when you mentioned it's affecting egg laying and reproduction, then I guess you're thinking more about the disruptive impacts of waves. So yeah, I would expect that, yeah, lakes where you're getting increased wave activity and storm activity are absolutely going to be more challenging for animals to inhabit, particularly from a reproductive point of view.
Yeah, great. We have another question. And again, if people have any questions as the talk has wrapped up, please feel free to drop it in the chat box here. But the next question that we currently have is, does the terrestrial invasion of the chelicerates have different consequences on flora when compared to the terrestrial invasion of the mandibulates?
So I think a lot of the chelicerates are thought to have been more predatory, carnivorous, but they're hypothesized to make up some of the earliest colonizers. So arachnids are thought to have been some of the initial part of the very initial wave of things moving onto land, and that's what's predicted by molecular clock models. Whereas when we see things like the Myriapoda, for example, mandibulates, yeah, I think they're more detritivorous, herbivorous, so they'll have a greater impact on the flora. So yeah, I would say that chelicerates will probably have had less impact on flora because they're more depending on other invertebrate taxa as food sources rather than plants as food sources.
Okay. Great. Thank you for answering. Let's see if we have any last minute questions that have come through. Okay, nothing so far, but maybe hopefully people stick around for tea time, and if there are more questions that come, please feel free to ask Anthony then. He will be staying around for tea time. If not, Anthony, thank you again for the talk, and I will take over the screen share.
Great.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, again for joining us. This screen is loading. Okay, yeah. And once again, you will find the weekly feedback form in the chat so that we can learn a bit more about who attended today's seminar. Next week, we have Miranda joining us from the University College London, who will be talking about South American climate and the Andes, influence Ithorian mammal diversity through time and latitude. Hope to see you next week. And up next is the tea time with today's speaker. It's informal conversation. And to kick things off, there is a question based on the talk. And the question is sort of like an icebreaker: is which geographic region would you visit to view trace fossils? With that, get up, walk around, have a quick drink of water. I will start a 2-minute timer and hope to see many of you at the tea time.